Hello and welcome everybody. This session is called How the Jewelry Industry Funds Flow, and I'm going to introduce myself and our other speakers before we get started. My name is Annabelle Davidson. I am a New Zealander by birth, as you probably can tell from my very strong accent, based in London. I'm the editor of Vanity Fair on jewelry. I am also a freelance writer for a number of different publications. I've written for British Vogue and the New York Times and the Telegraph over here in the UK. And I have a special interest in the provenance of the materials that go into jewelry, which is the subject that I love. Joining us today, we have some incredible speakers. We have Dr. Joseph Hanlon, probably one of the world's foremost experts on Mozambique, a prolific author of many books and a longtime journalist, and a visiting senior fellow, Department of International Development at London Schools of Economics and Political Science. We have Sarah Yu, Deputy General Counsel from the Jewellers Vigilance Committee, Louis Marechal, Sector Lead Minerals and Extractives for the OECD Centre for Responsible Business Conduct, Dewa Mavinga, Southern Africa Director for Human Rights Watch, and we are going to get started straight away with Dr. Hanlon, who is going to present his special subject of interest, which is Mozambique. And after that, there will be time for questions at the end of everyone's presentations. So Dr. Hanlon, take it away.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me to this conference, and good afternoon or morning, whichever it is. It's afternoon where I am. I want to talk about Mozambique's ruby curse. And I want to start with a brief history of Mozambique, because that's relevant to what has happened. Mozambique was a Portuguese colony. There was a decade-long war by Frelimo, which finally won independence in 1975. The socialist government under Samora Machel was not acceptable to the United States. This was the height of the Cold War, and so the 1980s saw a proxy war with the US allied with apartheid South Africa, which killed 2 million Mozambicans. It's a war that very few people in the United States know about, but 2 million people died. The end of the war, at the end of the Cold War, all of the US proxy wars stopped, and the World Bank and the IMF helped to rebuild Mozambique. But there was a condition that the Frelimo leaders who had been socialist had to become both capitalists and oligarchs. And the motto was the motto of the era, greed is good. Remember, this is the post-Cold War period. The same thing happened in Russia, Eastern Europe, Central Asia. It was called shock therapy. Mozambique is the only country in Africa where this was imposed. The independence struggle had started in Cabo Delgado province in the far north. 2 local generals in the independence war are still on Frelimo's ruling political commission, and they took control of Cabo Delgado province. The World Bank-backed greed is good meant the oligarchs prospered, but the local people did not. You have to remember, this is not the model that Frelimo and the Mozambicans wanted. The United States killed 2 million Mozambicans to impose this model on Mozambique. And that is the background of issues that we're discussing at this conference. Now, Mozambique also has a long history of artisanal mining of gemstones in northern Mozambique. And those miners are known by the Brazilian word garimpeiros. And there are many kinds of stones, but Mozambique is best known for tourmalines and rubies. And there are thousands of garimpeiros in Mozambique. In 2009, garimpeiros found a major ruby deposit in Montepuez, Cabo Delgado. The local oligarch, General Raimundo Paixão, used his power to grab 34,000 hectares. But it was occupied by villages, by farmers, by garimpeiros. He tried to clear it by force, but has never totally succeeded. And a decade later, that struggle continues. Partly because those displaced have no way to earn a living. There's no farmland, other farmland in the area. There's no other jobs. The reason the West created the oligarchs is that the oligarchs, thank you. The reason that the West created oligarchs in the first place is that they control the local land and resources, but they use Western companies to exploit it. So there's an agreement between multinational corporations and the oligarchs. And sure enough, General Pashanwapa sold 75% of his ruby mine to Gemfields in 2012. Now, you keep the elites in these companies. The local ruby company is chaired by Samora Machel Jr., who is the son of the first president, and the director of corporate affairs is Pashanwapa's son. Now, there is still considerable violence in the area, and the tort and human rights violations were first exposed by local journalist Estacio Veloy in 2015 in a widely seen Al Jazeera film. And so our question, in a sense, is how do you respond? And it's actually quite difficult to bring pressure locally against oligarchs that have so much global support. Gemfields at the point was a British company. It isn't anymore. So a whole group of people, including myself, took a case to the London High Court in 2018. There were 273 claims that were brought. 8 people were said to have been killed by mine security forces and the Mozambican police, including by shooting, beating to death, and burying alive. There were 200 claims of beatings, torture, and sexual abuse. There were village burnings, expelling people from farms. And the key point about the expulsions is that those evicted have no way to earn a living. Gemfields finally agreed to go to mediation, which is reasonably common with this sort of hybrid action, and it agreed to settle all of the claims, and it paid $8 million, which may seem like a lot of money, but the ruby auctions continued, and the auction in April of this year earned them $60 million. So $8 million to the victims of murder and so on is petty cash. Now, the thing is that Gemfields points out correctly, it pays its taxes. It paid $12 million in taxes in 2020. And that those taxes do indeed go to help Mozambique fund schools and health posts and the rest of it. But the violence continues, albeit at a reduced level. And it's not just Gemfields. In 2016, Mozambique passed a law that effectively stops artisanal mining so that all mining is controlled by big oligarchs and big companies. But these people have to earn a living. There are thousands of people who earn their living as Garam Parish. And so it failed to control artisanal mining, but it did give a license for the police to attack and kill Garam Parish. Just a couple of weeks ago, 3 more Garam Parish were killed in Nampula province. And of course, the illegal trade is also controlled by the oligarchs. It's not just the legal trade they control. And so it's said that Raimondo Pashanwapa also controls the illegal ruby trade. So every Mozambican ruby you buy has passed through the hands of a ruling oligarch. Gemfields pays its taxes, which supports schools and health posts. And we have to remember that this is a government that the US fought to put into power. And the United States and the World Bank still strongly support this government. And this year, the World Bank doubled its support for Mozambique. So what do we do? What do we say? I mean, the first conclusion is that Mozambican rubies are nasty. But if you want them for your jewelry, you have to buy them from Pashanwapa and Gemfields. How do we help? What can we do? Well, the most useful thing is probably to support Estacio Veloy and the other journalists were risking their lives to expose the ruby curse. But we should remember that Mozambican rubies are cursed. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Hanlon, so very much. That was an incredibly succinct and powerful presentation. I'm not going to ask you any questions just yet. I think we're going to go straight on to our next speaker, unless any of our other speakers have something they'd like to say. Sarah or Dewa or Louis? Okay, next up is Dewa Mavinga, who's talking specifically on Zimbabwe. Dewa, take it away.
Thank you so much, Annabelle, and thanks to the organizers of this important discussion. I will talk about diamonds in Zimbabwe, in the east of the country, the Marango diamond fields. Now, these diamonds are alluvial diamonds that were discovered back in 2007. And upon their discovery, it was villagers in the community, in the area that the diamonds were discovered, who primarily were scratching with their bare hands and digging with shovels to try and find diamonds to sell. But soon enough, the government put an order that declared this Marango area, Chiadzwa area, a protected area, and deployed the security forces, the police and the soldiers, to drive out miners and villagers. And this resulted in extreme human rights abuses in 2008, 2009, including killings of more than 200 artisanal miners and the displacement of thousands more. In 2009, Human Rights Watch and other groups raised alarm around the abuses and appealed to the Kimberley Process Certification Scheme, which is responsible for the governance of diamonds globally, to take action and ensure that human rights abuses in Marango diamond fields come to an end. There was a strong resistance from the government of Zimbabwe, which did not want to remove the military and the police from those fields. And there were a number of companies that were put together to mine the diamonds, including joint partnerships between the Zimbabwean army and the Chinese companies. So there was Anjin, which is a joint partnership between the Chinese and the Zimbabwean governments. There were a number of other interest groups, including Russian mining companies, and all those companies were coming together, had to have a 50-50 partnership arrangement with the government of Zimbabwe. The biggest challenge was of human rights abuses and smuggling and looting of the diamonds, which the government was letting happen because many of those that were responsible for the looting had connections to the security forces and to the government. The Kimberley Process Certification Scheme, in its intersessional meeting in Namibia in June 2009, then took a decision to press the government of Zimbabwe and to insist that there should be a suspension of the sale of the Marango diamonds from Zimbabwe, pending the implementation of a work plan that would see human rights violations ending in the fields, in Marango diamond fields, and then also the government putting in place mechanisms to prevent looting and smuggling, and also to ensure that the companies involved had clear mechanisms for accountability. This was not properly done, but a few years later, the suspension of the Marango diamonds was lifted. The bulk of the army was removed from those diamond fields. The levels of human rights abuses lessened, but the looting of the diamonds, the smuggling of the diamonds, which was almost state-sanctioned, continued and even increased. So much so that at one point, formally in the Parliament of Zimbabwe. The former president of Zimbabwe, Robert Mugabe, the late, publicly acknowledged that as much as 15 billion US dollars worth of diamond revenue had not been accounted for, could not be accounted for. There were a number of reports that were compiled locally by Parliament and by others that showed that there was excessive looting of those diamonds. There was no accountability. There were systems in which these companies would not declare the real value of what they were taking out of the country, which meant that there was no tax paid, and which meant that there was virtually no accountability. And so in terms of who benefits from the diamond revenue in Zimbabwe, primarily, when you look at the case study of the Marango diamond fields, it is primarily the state and the companies involved, including the Chinese, the Russians, and others. We have links and connections with the state. The people of Zimbabwe, who should otherwise be benefiting by way of royalties and taxes that are paid by these companies, are losing out because of massive corruption and because of these systems of diverting resources and lack of accountability that exists at the moment in Zimbabwe. We have raised issues about the need to end corruption and to ensure transparency and accountability. And over the years, since the discovery of diamonds in Marango in 2007, we have seen that communities have repeatedly been, complaining, protesting, demonstrating about how they have been abused, how they've been displaced without compensation, how they have been subjected to abuses by state security forces, private security guards of these companies, and how they have not benefited from this diamond resource in their area. So as far as they're concerned, the diamond resource has become a curse because instead of benefiting, they are on the receiving end. The area where they live in has been cordoned off. It is declared a protected area in terms of the law, which means that access is restricted. People have to apply for permits to be able to go into those areas. But these are areas where communal people have their grazing fields, they've got the places where they go to get water, and now they are policed, they are harassed about what they are doing when they would be heading their cattle in those fields. And we have continued to record a lot of abuses. And recently, in the last few weeks, 28 villagers, including their headmen, were arrested and charged because they were protesting against the Chinese company Anjin because they are losing out, they are not benefiting at all. And they are saying that although they see that these companies are operating in these areas, they see no benefit to them. They continue to be at the receiving end in terms of human rights abuses. And the Kimberley process certification scheme has not been very helpful because it has so far resisted attempts to broaden the definition of conflict diamonds to include those diamonds that are mined in the context of serious human rights abuses. So according to the Kimberley Process Certification Scheme, there is a very narrow definition of conflict diamonds, which says that there must be a rebel movement involved in benefiting from those diamonds. So in cases like Zimbabwe, where it is the state security forces themselves that are committing the abuses, the Kimberley Process says it has no mandate to look at that because there is no rebel movement. So that is a major weakness on the part of the Kimberley Process certification scheme that we have seen, that it has not been able to ensure that Marango diamonds can be certified to be clean, to be without blood, and to have been mined in a context which is respectful of human rights. So this is the situation in Zimbabwe. It's very difficult for the people who see the diamonds being mined in their areas, but not benefiting them at all, only benefiting those high up in terms of the government leadership, as well as the so-called investors who come in on the back of these government authorities. So that is, in brief, the situation in Zimbabwe, and I would say those are my introductory remarks. Thank you so much, Annabelle. Thank you.
Dewa, thank you so much. I do actually have a question. I know that there are reforms underway for the Kimberley process, but presumably those the diamonds from Marango are entering the sort of general diamond supply chain, even if it is going via Chinese mining interests. They are ending up in jewelry. It's not like they're ending up, hidden away somewhere. They're getting into the market.
That is correct, Annabelle. And this is why we had previously said the Marango diamonds should not be sold when there are abuses that are not resolved at the source of the mine. But of course, the weakness is with the Kimberley Process Certification Scheme, because it certifies diamonds at national level, and consumers will therefore not be able to trace and distinguish and identify that these are Marango diamonds. And we had insisted, and for a brief moment, the Kimberley process did suspend the Marango diamonds from being sold when the abuses were at their peak. But now, when there are hundreds of people suffering, there is no attention to that. And the Kimberley process has moved away from monitoring, attempts to correct the human rights issues that are in the fields. And therefore, as we speak, the Marango diamonds are not restricted. They are being sold on the global market, and there are no limits in terms of where they end up. Thank you.
Dewa, it's a really interesting subject, the provenance of not just diamonds, but gemstones. And it's one that many people say is an impossible conundrum, and that we can't trace all these things. But there are so many initiatives and developments from everything from blockchain to initiatives by large diamond mining companies to enable exactly that, to enable the tracing of all gemstones, which is really, really important. There's a side conversation going on that we are going to come back to. Sean Gilbertson, CEO of Gemfields, is on the chat, and he's talking with Dr. Hammond, but we'll come back to that because I do want to give everyone a turn. So thank you so much, Dewa. And next we are going to go to Sarah Yude, who is going to be speaking specifically on Myanmar, jade, and rubies and sanctions.
Thank you, Annabelle, and thank you everybody for joining us today. My name is Sarah Yude. I am Deputy General Counsel at the Jewelers Vigilance Committee. For those of you who don't know, JVC is a 100-plus-year-old trade association in the jewelry industry, and we help jewelers with legal compliance all along the jewelry supply chain. I'm talking to you today about Myanmar simply because 9 years ago, when I started working at JVC, we got a question one day about the Tom Lantos Jade Act, and nobody knew anything. And I was the newest attorney, and someone said, "Okay, Sarah, go figure this out." So I have been doing research and learning about gemstones in the country for quite some time. And I think we'll talk just a little bit about the history of how we got to this place where we currently are. And I want to just say that I'm probably going to use the word Burma most of the time when I talk, instead of the name of the country, Myanmar. Myanmar is the name that the military use to describe the country. Burma is the name that the people use. And the US government tends to use the word Burma, and so I will be following the same. But if you hear them used interchangeably, that's just some background on why there are two names for this country. So for many decades, the military was controlled the country of Burma. This has been happening for quite some time. In 2008, US Congress passed what was called the Tom Lantos Block Burmese Jade Act. This was a product-specific ban of the import of Burmese rubies and jadeite. I am certain that those of you who deal in colored gemstones dealt with this, because the laws were particularly interesting. They blocked the product themselves. They did not, however, block existing Burmese product that was already in the United States. So there was a lot of work when people were trading in these gemstones to show provenance of the gemstones to show that they had entered the US before 2008. So color gemstone dealers I think got pretty used to, proving that kind of documentation when they were dealing with Burmese ruby in particular. That ban continued until about 2016. It was extended by executive order for many times. And in 2016, the Obama administration decided not to renew the ban. And it was in large part due to the fact that the country of Burma was making great progress towards democratic rule. There had been protests in the country, against the military. The people of Burma wanted a democracy. There were leaders who were promoting democracy and promoting free and fair elections. And so as a solidarity move and as an acknowledgement that the country was moving towards democratic rule, the Obama administration decided to lift the ban on the trade in Burmese ruby and jadeite. It was good but tenuous, and despite the fact that the country had made significant progress and was holding elections, including, for the leader Aung San Suu Kyi, who is, a leader for the democracy movement in the country. On February 1st of this year, the military executed a coup, essentially, and retook control of the entire country and of the government. And so following this coup, which by the way was extremely violent and multiple people were killed, and it was really horrific for the people of Burma. Following this coup, there have been months and months of protest by civilians in the country. The military has killed over 1,250 people as of yesterday. They have detained over 7,000 people for protesting against this military coup. It just so happens that a couple of days ago, they released about 5,000 of those people that they had been detaining in advance of a 3-day holiday that's coming up. But that doesn't mean anything about, about how they're reacting. And in response to this, the United States has issued these progressive sanctions against different military leaders and entities in the government. And these sanctions are very specifically targeted to hit both the leaders in the military who are, planning and executing and dealing with this, and also the government entities that are controlled by the military. The problem is that the military government in Burma takes all of the natural resources of the country and uses them to enrich themselves and therefore maintain continued control over the people of Burma. So the U.S. has essentially said, okay, we're not going to do this. We're not going to allow the U.S. banking system and financial system to be, to benefit the military who has, created this coup and who are really, suppressing protests, suppressing speech, suppressing, human rights in the country. And so they have issued a series of progressive sanctions that are against specific military leaders, but they're also against the entire Ministry of Mining in the country. So the Ministry of Mining in Burma controls all legitimate gemstone mining. They're the ones who issue the licenses so that you can mine. They're the ones who grant ownership of mining tracts. They grant, they do all the marketing for gemstones from the country. They run the auctions or the sales that happen in the country of these gemstones. So the U.S. has essentially said, okay, we are sanctioning, all of these people are designated on the specially designated nationals list, which is essentially a list of people that as Americans, we cannot do business with. There's also some cultured pearl production in the country, and they've sanctioned that. And there are other gemstones other than rubies and jadeite that are mined in Burma. And so the sanctions are not product specific, they're people and entity specific. But because the Ministry of Mining controls basically the entire production of gemstone in the country, any legitimate gemstone that's coming out of the country is probably covered by these sanctions. The protest continues, and the suppression of human rights continues. Just yesterday, an American journalist was sentenced to 11 years imprisonment in a charge related to a news story from a newspaper where he hasn't worked in over a year. And it was a sham of a trial. And, this continues to be, it continues to be a challenge for anybody in the color gemstone business, because you have to really be sure that any material that you're dealing with is not originating in Burma. It's very hard to do. We also know, or can, I think very reasonably assume that there are probably gemstones that are being smuggled over the border into Thailand and then sold as Thai origin products. So it's really important to make sure that you know who you're actually dealing with, who your suppliers are, where they are getting their products, and making sure that you understand truly, how the sanctions work and how to operate them within your business. Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah. I was going to save this for the end, but as we discussed while preparing, I asked you to come up with 5 questions for all the jewelers listening, or those starting out in the jewelry trade. What questions should they be asking of potential suppliers of materials, ruby, emerald, gold, otherwise? What questions should they ask of their suppliers, at least as a start?
Sure. So I have 5 suggested questions that, people can expand on these. There are many companies in the jewelry industry who have quite a long vendor questionnaire that they ask their vendors to fill out. But I think these 5 are sort of the basics on what you should be looking for. So the first question is, how long have you been in business? Just because a business is new doesn't mean it's illegitimate, but certainly people with experience may better know how to navigate this complicated system. The second question is, where does this material come from? If you are dealing with rubies that are coming from Thailand, I think there's a reasonable risk that those rubies might actually be Burma origin. So you'll want to ask where the material comes from and how it got there. The third question I encourage jewelers to ask is, what beneficiation does this material provide for the communities where it is mined? It's a complicated question, and I don't know that there are a lot of, great answers that you're going to get, but we have to start asking these questions of our suppliers to let them know that it's important to us, that this is a value that we want to care about as we're selecting our products. The fourth question is, has the material been treated? This is actually just important to know, because if it has, you might need to disclose that to your consumer, and it'll give you information on how to handle the material. If emeralds are oiled, for example, you might treat them differently than you would if they weren't, or things like that. So has the material been treated? And then 5, the question is, who are your business partners, and do you have an anti-money laundering program? Here in the US, it is actually required that we make sure that our suppliers have an AML program. Our suppliers are precious metals, precious gems, and finished jewelry. So this is a required question by law, but also you'll want to make sure that, the businesses and people that you're dealing with are also themselves dealing with legitimate actors. And of course, there's like this, huge question about beneficial ownership. The U.S. is moving towards a system where they're essentially trying to eliminate shell companies that businesses can hide behind. And I think that's coming down the pike in terms of continuing legislation and regulations here in the US, where not only are we going to need to find out who our suppliers are, but we're going to need to find out who the beneficial owners of those companies are. So those are the 5 that I would start with. And of course, you can expand from there.
Sarah, thank you so much. I think a lot of people are scared to ask questions. And, I know from being quite a nosy person and asking all sorts of jewelry companies.
Me too.
What is it? There is a tendency to say, from a trusted supplier, or we don't disclose our suppliers because it's proprietary information, or we don't want to let the competition know. But the fact is that as consumers, we have the right to know where the things we buy come from. And as Dr. Hanlon said to me when we spoke, I think last year, if we can trace beans to Kenya, every single bean in that packet from the supermarket, why can't we trace our gold, our gemstones, our diamonds to their country, to their mine of origin, and those people who are mining them?
If you can put a QR code on my avocado and tell me where that was grown, I'm pretty sure we should figure that out for more expensive material.
Yeah, well, there's lots of things. I know. I can see Brandy Dello, we can trace diamonds, and I know that a lot of amazing work is being done. There's a lot of initiatives. This is just in our chat, by the way. Before I go to you, Louis, I'm going to just read out a question. I'm trying to work out whether I can invite Sean Gilbertson, who has just posted a question on our chat, whether I can ask him to go face to face with Dr. Hanlon, but I don't know if I can. But Sean says the idea that oligarchs control Mozambique. By the way, Sean is, if I didn't say so before, the CEO of Gemfields. He says the idea that oligarchs control Mozambique ruby is utter nonsense. The idea that Mozambique rubies are cursed is nonsense too. I too am happy to talk about Mozambique ruby and to set the record straight. Dr. Hanlon has replied, Sean, are you saying that Pachinwapa, which is the general Dr. Hanlon has mentioned, is not an oligarch? And Sean has replied saying, I'm saying he does not control Mozambique ruby. Gemfields controls MIM, and MIM accounts for 94% of Mozambique's ruby, emerald, and sapphire income since January 2011. Dr. Hanlon, can I give you the opportunity to respond to that? You'll have to, yeah.
Okay, yeah. Of course, he would say that. That's his business. And they did all of this campaigning 10 years ago about how these were wonderful rubies, and they settled in a British court accepting compensation for over 200 claims of misconduct. Carefully not said. What they said was, we don't admit we'll compensate all the people who claimed. But if you look back at the history of this, Pachinwapa, who is an oligarch, we'll both agree on that, grabbed 34,000 hectares, the whole mine, and used his forces and so on to try to clear off all the people who were there. So Pachinwapa was behind this, and he's the one who stopped the artisanal mining, which created many more jobs and much more local income than Gemfields has created since. And Pachinwapa still owns 25%, and it's the Mozambicans that are appointed are his son, Samora Michel Jr. So yes, the Gemfields officially controls this, but it's Pachinwapa who runs the Mozambican version of this. And I think the problem is that the whole operation from the beginning was to take the mining of rubies and gemstones in general away from small miners, to give it to control to Gemfields and a number of other large companies who are slowly controlling gemstones in general, and also gold. And I think that we shouldn't say, well, all right, this is all clean because we're legal companies. The whole point about doing that history is to explain that Mozambique is a corrupt oligarch-run country in which Gemfields, yes, is legal, and as are all these other companies. But this does not mean that ordinary Mozambicans are benefiting from these rubies and the other gemstones at all. So of course he can say we're legal, we pay taxes, and yes, he does. And I think, companies should pay rather more taxes than they do, but that's all right. But it's not, this is not making, just because Gemfields is this wonderful, nice company, it doesn't make his rubies clean.
Dr. Hanlon, how would you feel about me inviting Sean Gilbertson to talk just with a 5-minute limit in the interest of fairness?
Sure, you can say anything you want. I mean, he has a whole marketing system that is saying these are wonderful rubies. I'm a mere journalist, so.
Okay, let's do this. Kirsten, who is content manager, are you able to invite Mr. Gilbertson to join us? We're just on a speaker chat at the moment. I believe she can. Mr. Gilbertson, I think you'll receive an invitation to join us. While we're waiting for that, I'd like to point out it's been quite interesting that both Dewa and you, Dr. Hanlon, have referred to the curse of diamonds and the curse of rubies. That word curse has been used twice. I feel, Sarah, you haven't used the word curse, but here we are. Here's Mr. Gilbertson. Welcome to our talk. We can't see you, but I think we can hear you.
Good. You should be able to hear me. Good evening, Annabelle. And
Hi.
Try and see whether or not I can give you video as well.
There we are. All right. Thank you. Thank you for joining us. Sean, I'm just going to give you 5 minutes. This is not part of our planned trajectory, and we only have an hour and a quarter, and I've got other people to speak. So you and Joseph, off you go, 5 minutes.
Perfect. Thank you. And I genuinely don't mean to interject or sort of hijack proceedings this evening in any way, but it's probably worth having a conversation like this where one gets all of the different views on the table. I think that's vitally important. One of the interesting things that I picked up on, which Dr. Hanlon said, was that the income to artisanal miners was far greater than the income that Gemfields or Montepuez Ruby Mining has generated. And I am afraid, ladies and gentlemen, that is simply wholly untrue. The Bank of Mozambique publishes data, its balance of payments data, in which it has one specific category for emeralds, rubies, and sapphires, collectively showing all the money coming into Mozambique for those 3 gemstone types. And what's amazing about that data is it goes back all the way to January 2011. As we know, in Mozambique, the deposit was discovered in 2009, and there was a lot of artisanal mining in 2009, 2010, 2011, and there was artisanal and illegal mining in 2011, 2012, 2013, 2014, and 2015. It's very interesting from the Bank of Mozambique data that in 2011, Mozambique earned nothing from emeralds, rubies, and sapphires. That's the entire country. 2012, Mozambique earned nothing from emeralds, rubies, and sapphires. That's the entire country. 2013, it was less than $250,000. And if we add up all the money that Mozambique has earned from emeralds, rubies, and sapphires since January 2011, 94% of the money comes from Montepuez Ruby Mining. And to date, MRM has sold approximately $640 million worth of rubies from that deposit, of which approximately $160 million has been paid to the Mozambican government. And the other item, which is very often forgotten by parties who are looking to criticize large-scale mining, is that 1,450 permanent jobs have been created at Montepuez Ruby Mining, of which more than 90% are held by Mozambican citizens. And I should also point out that in 2020, with the pandemic, we had to face the unfortunate decision of having to close the mining operation entirely for a year, but not a single person was made redundant. We kept 1,450 employees on site through the pandemic, in a year when Montepuez ruby mining had zero income. And conscious of the time, Annabelle, I'll just also add that what we have seen is Zambia become the largest exporter of emeralds in the world, Mozambique become the largest exporter of rubies in the world. And in the chat here, we're partly criticized of somehow being involved in a kleptocracy. And to be somewhat controversial, I will say that the true kleptocracy is the way that in which for decades, artisanal and illegal miners have been cheated out of proper prices for their gemstones. And the big trend that I believe we've seen in Zambia and Mozambique in the last 10 years is that for the first time, host countries are getting the true international value of their gemstones repatriated back into the country because the price isn't set at the point of export. That's a kind of...
Pause you, Sean. Can we please allow Dr. Hanlon to reply at this point?
Okay, let me make one point very clear. I'm talking about local income. Sean is talking about government income. And that's actually very important here because basically Mozambique wants to capture the gem money for the government. And before Gemfields took over this mining, there were thousands of people on this land who were earning livings, and they were setting up, there were whole chains, value chains. Now, the problem, of course, is that the export of these rubies was all semi-legal because the oligarchs in Delgado controlled this, still do to a major extent. And so a lot of these gems were going to Thailand, rubies were going to Thailand, others. But the money which was being earned by the Garam Parish and the economy that created is larger than the impact on the local community than Gemfields has now. Now, so the question in a sense here is, are we dealing with the benefit to the local people, or are we only worried about the tax money that goes to the government? Now, obviously the government needs tax money, and I'm not arguing against that. But other countries have encouraged structured artisanal mining with buying systems. This is very common with gold. And one of the things that the original independence government was doing was setting up artisanal mining cooperatives. And of course, that's one of the things that the US didn't very much like because they don't like cooperatives. That's socialist. So what we're looking at is, yes, by big companies controlling the mining sector, there is more tax money going to the government, but there is less resources which go to local people to support their living. And it's interesting. I mean, there's also a major war going on in Cabo Delgado now. And a number of the people who were early fighters in that civil war were people who had been displaced from the Montepuez ruby mines. And they decided that the only way that they could they decided they were going to fight against the government to try to get some share of the resources. So what we have is a situation where, yes, the government gets money, but the local people don't. And this is a problem not just with the rubies, but with tourmalines, with the gas, with the graphite, which is also in Cabo Delgado. So it's, how do we get, do we accept that, okay, it's large corporations and government that get the money, or do we want this to benefit local communities? Now, yes, as Sean said, there's 1,000 jobs created, but there were many more than 1,000 jobs in those 34,000 hectares before Pashanwapa took over. And remember, it was Pashanwapa who took the land. So you can never say that this doesn't come out of the oligarchs.
Sean, I'm giving you 30 seconds to respond because it's not fair on our last speaker, Louis Machiavel.
No, of course. There's so much to cover here. And
right, we should do another panel on this, but please go ahead.
I'd love to repeat it on another occasion where we can delve into the detail because it's so vitally important. I I don't think, with due respect, Dr. Hanlon, you understand the circumstances of the jobs that you think existed in 2009, 10, or 11. The conditions in those villages were absolutely horrific. It is not stable income. Many of the individuals there were run by syndicates, indebted to the syndicates, being paid 1 or 2 cents on the dollar for any rubies they found. They were not free to sell their rubies. Their rubies had to be sold to the syndicate that they were contracted to. It was a real mess. And I do believe that locally at the moment, Mozambican citizens get much more money than what existed in 2009, 10, 11. And it's a discussion for another day, but I would be really, really intrigued to understand how it is that you believe General Patungaba did a land grab over this area, and or indeed who all these evicted people were. There are 7 villages on our license. One of them, in Toro village, has been resettled by agreement with the provincial government, the federal government, and obviously also the communities concerned. But I'm conscious of time, Annabelle. I appreciate your accommodating it.
Okay, thank you very much, Sean, for joining us. And I am going to ask Kristen now to not kick you off, but say goodbye. And we, Dr. Helen, will come back to you again. But now we go to our final speaker, Louis Marichal, who is going to be talking to us on the subject of gold flow in Venezuela.
Thank you very much. I hope you can all hear me okay.
Yep, you're all good.
Fantastic. Initially wanted to show some slides, but I'm a bit cautious with the technique and technology, so I'll just stick to my speech. Thank you for having the OECD today. Good morning or good evening to all of you. I wanted to talk here today about a recent report that the OECD has published on the gold supply chains out of Venezuela. As part of our work here at the OECD, we regularly commission what we call baseline assessments of supply chains of gold, in particular in specific geographies. We've been working in the DRC, on Sahel, on Colombia, and so recently on Venezuela. Just some high-level figures and findings that I wanted to share here with you today before taking in some Q&As, which I always like best. The estimates of the research that was actually conducted by RC Consilium, which is a consultancy based in the US, was that approximately up to 75 tons of gold are actually produced on a yearly basis in Venezuela, all of which coming from artisanal and small-scale mining entities, because there's no large-scale mining operations in the country at the moment. So that amounts to approximately $4.4 billion of production on a yearly basis, which is quite stunning. And what the research has actually found is that all of the production and trade of gold in the country is to different extent associated with either severe violations of human rights or serious economic crimes, and also to some extent conflict financing, as several non-state armed groups that are active across the borders are involved in the production and trade of gold in the country. This all basically not necessarily started, but accelerated in 2016 when the Orinoco Arc mining region was opened by the government. Since then, the production has expanded beyond that region. But the gold production has been extremely intense ever since then. And what the researchers found is that you actually have two sort of distinct supply chain. One that was sort of called dispersed flows, and the other was called centralized flows. Some of the gold actually makes its way into formal / domestic legal channels in the country, and ultimately is channeled to the Central Bank of Venezuela, where it has an official legal status, and then through that central bank, the gold makes its way to international markets. The other channel, so-called dispersed flows, is where the artisanal gold is actually processed and traded informally and illegally, and leaves the country through transboundary smuggling networks, making its way through neighboring countries or other countries in the region. This second supply chain model is actually, to a great extent, controlled by politically exposed people, so people allegedly connected to the regime in Venezuela, as well as controlled by representatives of the official army, as well as, again, by gangs, domestic gangs, to some extent, gangs from the regions, and non-state armed group, as I just mentioned, in particular from Colombia. So the situation has only been worsening in the past 5 years. And our report actually calls on companies regionally and internationally to really check their supply chains to make sure that they are not sourcing gold that may be coming from Venezuela. One key finding that the research has uncovered is that a lot of the gold coming from the dispersed flows is actually channeled through the Dominican Republic. That was a key sort of unexpected finding of the research. Dominican Republic has some large-scale mining gold production, and also some artisanal small-scale mining gold production. But the figures that were actually collected by the researchers actually made little sense in the end, and it's very likely that a lot of the Venezuelan gold that's illegally extracted in the country is channeled through the Dominican Republic. Other transit hubs in the region have been found to go through Panama, Colombia, of course, for obvious reasons, Brazil, Suriname, and Guyana. Now, all of those countries serve, as I said, as transit hubs and enable the smuggling of gold into international markets. The gold can then go to countries where refining capacity exists. Sometimes it can be the US, some countries in Europe as well, the Middle East, obviously. And there was also allegations that gold may be channeled through a couple of refineries in Mali, in West Africa, even though this was not yet confirmed. So what really this research has again stressed is how fluid and complex gold supply chains can be, and the need for business attention to be put on the provenance of the gold, and to what extent companies throughout the supply chain are actually making sure that they have systems in place that allow them to understand the circumstances of the production and trade of the gold that they are sourcing. So this research was, as I said, published in September. The Spanish version will soon be published and released as well. And we are looking at following up on that work with additional research, in particular on the role of free trade zones in the region, as well as maritime ports. Oftentimes, it is alleged that gold is smuggled through airplanes, and that is the most common way of getting gold out of the region. But one thing that we have found is that the COVID crisis has had an impact on that smuggling technique, that increasingly the role of maritime shipments may be increasing. So that's an area that we would like to further look into. As a general recommendation, something that we're telling our stakeholders is that solving the situation in Venezuela is going to be a very long-tracted effort, and certainly would involve a lot of cooperation from all actors, governmental, civil society, as well as of course the private sector. And there will be a very strong law enforcement angle into this to make sure that it gets increasingly harder for the smugglers to get their gold out of the country. So the report is available on our website. I'll make sure to share the link, and I'll just keep it at that in the interest of time, and happy to take on any questions that you may have. Thank you very much.
Louis, thank you so much for that. As I'm particularly interested in the gold supply chain, and have been trying to get my relatively small brain around it, because it's such a massive global complex issue, as are all materials used in jewelry. But gold, as such a stable holder of wealth, and which always has been, is a particular interest. And there are some really interesting initiatives coming about. One of those is done by a British refinery called the Betts Group, and they are working on a project called Single Mine Origin Gold, which is about sourcing gold from one mine, which is independently audited, segregating it and keeping that chain of segregation, chain of custody independently audited throughout. It's also via the use of a QR code, so that both jewelers and ultimately consumers of that jewelry can see that QR code, can find out exactly where that gold came from and how it affects the communities around that mine. It's an interesting, quite new initiative. They're looking at spreading it out, but it is one that I think is a positive step in the right direction. And obviously, of course, there's also fair mined gold and fair trade gold. None of these initiatives are perfect, but I think they are better than what is currently the global pot that is all the gold in the world basically ends up in one great big cauldron, and where it goes from that, after that, no one knows where it originally came from. So it's really interesting to focus on that one country, Venezuela, but it's an issue that affects so many countries. We've got another 15 minutes and we've got quite a few chats on the side. Sarah, can you see those chats? There's one that I feel is directed quite specifically at you. Let me just find it. It was regarding, where are
The
we?
one about the Jade Act and yes, great, perfect. I already spotted it.
For the audience first, and then
Yeah, sure. So there's two questions that are very related. First, the jewelry industry knew of the Jade Act, an actual law posted by Congress. For certain, the vast majority of the jewelry industry does not know about these current sanctions. I am assuming these sanctions are by presidential action. Yes, the they're generally authorized by presidential executive order, and then the sanctions are issued by the Treasury Department. And I promise you that if you think the jewelry industry doesn't know about this, it's not for lack of me trying. I think I gave 5 presentations to different trade groups, was quoted in JCK and National Jeweler on this topic, and was basically like screaming out my apartment window about this as much as I could, starting in February and March when this started happening. But it is absolutely a problem. And then the second part of that question, which I think is directly related, is so under the Patriot Act rules, do we as jewelers need to report to Homeland Security if we are approached to purchase Burmese gemstones? Do we need to report the sellers? There is a way that you can report suspicious transactions to the US government. You're actually reporting to the Treasury Department, who implements the Bank Secrecy Act. There's a form called the Suspicious Activity Report Form, or the SAR. You can file them online. And yes, if you are approached with a transaction that you think is suspicious or potentially linked to illegal or terrorist activity or money laundering, you should absolutely report that using the SAR form. And if you are at a point where you think you might want to file a SAR, you're welcome to get in touch with me, and I'm happy to tell you, give you some information about doing that. Generally, the answer is if you think you have to file a SAR, you should be filing a SAR.
Sarah, that's very generous, inviting the whole world to get in touch with you if they wanted to. How should they do that? Via LinkedIn, or what's the best method?
Yep, LinkedIn, or my email is sara@jvclegal.org.
There you go. Thank you very much. I'm just looking at some more of the questions. Where are we? Sean Clinton, who I think may be the Sean who came to me, commented on Instagram saying the diamond industry is a major source of funds for the Israeli military, but this is never mentioned by the jewelry industry or NGOs. Since the close of the conference last year, Israel has killed 342 Palestinians, including 86 children and 46 women. I feel like that subject is definitely on the agenda for one of the other panels. Sean, I think I responded to you too to say to have a look and see what else is, but like you said, I've raised this issue last year. It's still been ignored. Will the organisers put this on the agenda for the next conference? That's up to Susan Wheeler, who organised the conference, so we shall ask her, and I'm sure she'll get back to us on whether that's something that she will look at including next time. Um, who else have we got? Lots of people are sending me links that I can't access. Sorry, it's quite tricky when you're doing a live webinar to do so. A lot of talk about the Responsible Jewellery Council. Someone called Will Nevins Elderfar, owner of WR Metal Arts, asking Sean Gilbertson directly if he'd be willing to join a table after the session to talk more about gemfields. I'll leave that up to you guys. I now wonder, opening up to the speakers, Joe, Sarah, Dewa, Louis, of what you guys have all been speaking about, do you have questions for each other? We've got 10 minutes left. Anyone? No? Yes, Dewa. Thank you, Dewa.
Yes, thanks. I wanted to ask about the situation in Burma, Myanmar, because we have been following that previously. I think Nobel laureate, the leader, is it Aung San Suu Kyi? Is she? What sort of policies are being pursued by her party? Has she been arrested since the coup? What is happening? Because we have not been receiving much in terms of their positions and policies in terms of the control of resources, and also in terms of the sanctions and other measures. What would be their position if it has been made public? Thank you.
Yes, of course. That's a great question. Aung San Suu Kyi was arrested. She is currently on trial for various supposed crimes against the country. We know that the trial system, especially with military courts in the country, is a joke. A trial doesn't actually really mean anything. So she is likely to be convicted and imprisoned. And in fact, other leaders of her movement have also been arrested, are in the process of being tried, will probably be sentenced. So I can't honestly say that the party has any positions at the moment, because I think they are, under siege essentially. But I do know that the priority of the U.S. government in issuing sanctions has been to speak to people on the ground that they have access to make sure that the sanctions that they are issuing are hurting the military leaders and those who are controlling the government. And they're trying really hard not to harm the people of Burma. Of course, any sanctions on the natural materials in the country do hurt the people, but they are working very, very closely with NGOs and with others on the ground to try to make sure that they are not inadvertently causing a humanitarian crisis by issuing these sanctions. So it continues to be very complicated, and I'm not particularly optimistic.
Many thanks for that. Thank you.
Dr. Hanlon, did you have a question?
Well, not so much a question, but a comment to you, in fact, that if we look at vegetable tracing so that we know exactly which farm produces the mange tout peas, this only works because it's being controlled by very large corporations. They can set up these very detailed systems to do it. So if we're going to do track and trace for gold, if we're going to trace gemstones, it does cede control of the industry to very large corporations. Now, I think we need to think about, do we think that this is the right way to go forward? And I do watch in Mozambique as the really serious attempts to push artisanal miners out completely and give control to mining in general to very large corporations, does seem to reduce the income locally, does displace a lot of people. And I wonder, I don't know if there's any other way, there isn't any other way to do track and trace, except, if you're going to have QR codes for every gemstone, it's only going to be a large corporation that can control that. And I think that that's the implication of that amount of detailed tracing is that it is large corporate control.
Yeah, I do agree with that. I think one of the shifts we're seeing is as consumers become more and more aware of problematic origins of materials, we are starting to see, and it's actually thanks to social media, the uplifting of small-scale artisanal miners in places like Tanzania. There's an amazing group of women, the Tanzanian Women's Mining Cooperative. And some jewelers are starting to think that rather than getting the highest quality gemstones from wherever, you know, from Mozambique for rubies or you know, sapphires from Sri Lanka, that actually they would like to work with materials that support a real community. And QR codes don't matter when we get to see pictures of women miners with a handful of gems that may not be perfect, but they're really beautiful given their origin and what they're doing to the communities around them, and helping those artisanal miners access a global market and telling those stories, I think is a really beautiful thing. And I hope that, I feel it's part of my job to educate the consumer that there's actually a marketplace for these things, and it's not just a silly little crafty one. It's actually something I hope that some of the big brands are going to start noticing and start championing and celebrating smaller mining collectives of interesting stones. It doesn't have to be about the perfect rubies, the perfect sapphires, the perfect diamonds, or the perfect emeralds. There's actually some really, really interesting smaller stories out there. Winnick Lefevre is a wonderful Danish organization working directly with artisanal miners in Madagascar, selling untreated sapphires. They are absolutely beautiful. They're a rainbow of colors. You won't find a single true blue in there because they're untreated, like 99% of sapphires are treated. And I hope that's a shift we see more and more. I want to see people celebrating the stones of artisanal miners and connecting directly to them.
I would say that I would support that very strongly, and note that that's the way a number of the fair trade structures developed. Cocoa, for instance, and chocolate was by working directly with farming groups. It's used a lot with coffee as well. So I think that is definitely one way forward.
We just need people to actually care about the materials and the beautiful things that they buy. You know, and all due credit to some jewelers who've been doing this forever and just quietly, and haven't really made a big song and dance about it. Pippa Small, she's a London jeweler. She has been doing this for a very long time, working directly with small craftspeople in tiny areas in Afghanistan and all sorts of places. And I don't think people understand just how important her work is. She's been a real pioneer, but that's what I want to celebrate, and I want to champion in Vanity Fair. I'm not just about celebrating the jewels of the great maisons in Paris, etc. We need to see more of the beauty of the whole world and all the people that should be benefiting from the resources of the countries they live in. Right, guys, we've got less than a minute. So I really want to just say thank you so much to all of you for joining. We've got some really interesting comments here about promote responsible by working directly with women in mining in Nigeria, ensure mining collectives get the full international value for their gems. Right now they get paid a pittance by dealers and traders. Someone's asked how much of the miners at Gemfields get paid. I'd suggest following Estacio Valoy. He's a Mozambican investigative journalist and an incredibly passionate man. He is searching for all those answers. What else have we got? I see, Sarah, you've put up your Instagram. It's at UdESQ. Yanni Mellis, otherwise known as Gem Explorer, says that Winnick Lefevre are absolutely great. And people talking about tracking and tracing. Oh, Sarah's email address. Someone's asked for that again. Sarah, would you mind?
I already put it in the chat.
It's in the chat. So everyone in the chat, if you want to find it, it's there. Is Sarah, Sara, at jvclegal.org. And I can also see that Moyo Gems are working with Goobelin to enable mine-to-market traceability. So there is traceability available for some artisanal mining. It's not just large scale. There is so much more we can talk about. It's such a huge subject. It's one that I try and write about as much as I can. But for now, thank you so much, everyone, for joining. Obviously, there's a hell of a lot more to talk about. Susan, thank you for inviting us all. And I guess we just say goodbye.